Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.
In May of 1974, George Lucas finished the rough draft for what would ultimately become the first Star Wars movie, called Star Wars: A New Hope, to be released in 1977. George Lucas and his Star Wars universe changed the landscape of movies forevermore. This week's hero was born in the same year that George Lucas finished that rough draft. He, too, was involved in a startup project that would shift the way people viewed a different medium. This time, it all revolved around podcasts and ESPN. And to keep with the Star Wars theme, this guy's nickname is Pod Vader.
Welcome to the Football History Dude Podcast, where each episode is a journey back in time to learn about the rich history of the NFL. Your host is Arnie Chapman. Football is his passion, and he wants you to come along with him to explore the yesteryear of the gridiron. So hop on board his DeLorean and let's get this baby up to 88 miles per hour.
Great Scott!
This time as we step off the DeLorean, we have another guest riding shotgun with us. This is that guy named Pod Vader, Jay Soderberg. Now, like I said in the intro, this guy was born the same year that George Lucas finished his rough draft for the Star Wars. The Star Wars. That was a blockbuster, game-changing type of a movie. And so was another platform, the podcast space. Basically, this guy, Jay Soderberg, he built the podcast platform in ESPN. Now, he wasn't the only one, but he was there at the ground roots to start this podcast platform for ESPN and change the way we listen to podcasts forevermore. Just like George Lucas did back in 1974 when he's like, I finished my rough draft for this movie. But it wasn't movies for Jay Soderberg. Even though we're talking about Pod Vader and the whole darkdom and all that kind of thing with Star Wars, it was podcasts. He was the producer behind many of our favorite podcasts that came from ESPN. Most notably, the Fantasy Football Focus. That's with Matthew Berry and Nate Ravitz, and they changed how we looked at fantasy football, at least for me, for the dawn of time. I wanted to listen to these guys all the time because they give me the inside scoop on what I was going to do in my upcoming week for my fantasy football team. But on top of that, they had the comedy. And they also had the ability for me to be able to say, I want to listen to just fantasy football, and I want to listen to these guys. I want to listen to when I want it, and I want it now. And that's what podcasting has done for us. Like I said, at the beginning, Jay Soderberg, he saw this as the new opportunity, the new frontier. Well, I guess to stick with Star Wars, not the Star Trek ventures. But regardless of all that, we'll get into it. He went from ESPN, then he ended up going to Blog Talk Radio to be the head of content. Recently, Jay was hired as the first executive producer of Locked On Podcasts. Also, he's the host of a show called Next Fan Up. And I'll go ahead and leave links to the show about all these different things, for Jay Soderberg and Pod Vader at the show notes for you. And I created a dedicated page for Pod Vader, and you could check this out through your show notes and your podcast player, or you can head to his dedicated page at thefootballhistorydude.com/Pod Vader. That's Pod and then Vader. Again, that's thefootballhistorydude.com/Pod Vader. Also, while you're at it, I ask that you please subscribe for free to this show by mashing that little subscribe button in your podcast player of choice. That way you get the hottest, freshest off the press episodes each and every week. But getting into this episode, this is going to be a long-form interview, and it is a unique episode. The reason why it's unique is because we're not talking about the 1920s or the 1940s and the Steagles or anything like that. We're talking about really not that long ago. We're still in the 2000s. We don't talk about the 2000s a whole lot in this podcast because we're discussing the whole 100-year history of the NFL. And we want to know about the beginning. But what better way to talk about one of the next transformations that the NFL took, especially with fantasy football, podcasts creating the on-demand for sports fans around the world. And at the beginning of it was Pod Vader. The ESPN podcast. Now they really helped, I believe, podcasting and fantasy football take a whole nother leap. And Jay was at the start of it all. Maybe he wasn't the only guy in charge, or he wasn't, the one person. But there's a reason why he's nicknamed Pod Vader. And this episode's going to help peel back the curtains for us so we can see how this whole thing was built at the beginning. Just like we do for the beginning of the NFL. One of the next chapters, podcasting, ESPN. But let's not just sit on here. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's talk about it with the guy that can give us the inside scoop, Mr. Pod Vader. This time as we step off the DeLorean, the date is 2005, and we are in Bristol, Connecticut. We have a guest riding shotgun with us. His name is Pod Vader. Welcome, Pod Vader.
Hi, Arnie. How are you?
Well, Pod Vader is a nickname, right? That's Jay Soderberg's really who we're interviewing.
If you really want to get technical, it's Jason Soderberg, but most people call me Jay or Pod Vader.
I prefer to go by the moniker of Pod Vader, and I was doing a little bit of research. I found something. Did you realize that you're in the Urban Dictionary?
Yes, that I know.
Yeah, just for the listeners out there, I'm going to read off what Pod Vader means in the Urban Dictionary. It's a Star Warsian nickname for ESPN podcast producer Jay Soderberg. So how did you get that nickname?
In the terms of the timeline, if we wanted to fast forward to 2006, was when I was officially promoted to digital audio producer. And at that point was the point that I was officially in charge of all of the content regarding podcasts that were being produced at ESPN. And a couple of my hosts, the most famous ones from the Fantasy Focus football podcast, Matthew Berry and Nate Ravitz, said, yeah, digital audio producer doesn't really encompass. That's not the right title for him. We need to give him a different title, one that sort of is geeky and puts him more in his place. So they originally were going to call me the Podfather, to which I said that nickname's already been taken by Adam Curry. And they also said, well, we weren't going to give it to you anyway because it was too cool. We're going to call you Pod Vader because you're evil. You're always trying to ruin these podcasts. You're telling us things that we should be doing, and we don't want to do them. And so Pod Vader was born, and it was meant to be sort of like as I said, sort of a geeky nickname to sort of put me in my place. And instead I embraced it. And it was history ever since.
Yeah, I mean, that the first time I ever heard Pod Vader was from the Fantasy Focus show. I remember, I can't pinpoint the year that I first started listening to podcasts, but I remember listening it while I was cutting lawns, and the very first one was Beyond the To-Do List, but then the second one was Fantasy Football Focus, because that's what I was interested in. There's Pod Vader talking about the Patriots.
Yeah, if it's not the Patriots, then it's something football related.
Sure, and that's really what this is all about, the history of the NFL. We're in the 100th season, and I do believe that podcasting has helped, I don't say all-encompassing, but it's really been a big boost as far as fantasy football goes, and Matthew Berry and the shows that you produced and everything like that. So I kind of wanted to start there at the beginning. Let's take the DeLorean, and is it fair to say that you were at the ground level of the ESPN podcast network?
Yes, that is definitely fair to say. The way that we had approached podcasting, or ESPN had approached podcasting at that point, it was early 2005. They had already done some online broadcasts, just shows that were created specifically for an online audience. But it wasn't really podcasting the way that we understand podcasting now. They were just digital-only shows. I was brought into the office and was told, we need to do this thing called podcasting. And in 2005, what is everyone's response when they hear that word? What is a podcast? And the bosses told me, we don't know either, but you're going to find out. And that's when I put my nose, or better yet, I put my earbuds to the grindstone and started listening to whatever I could find about podcasting. I listened to a lot of Adam Curry. I listened to a lot of Leo Laporte from the This Week in Tech show, because those were the two guys that were, at that particular point, talking the most about podcasting. Did my research all about Adam Curry and how he basically invented it with Dave Weiner. At that point in time, that's when it clicked for me, was just sort of like, oh, I don't have to have my peanut butter and chocolate together, even though they're delicious together. I can get my football without listening to the baseball or the basketball or the college news. I can get it all separate. This is phenomenal. This is the greatest thing ever. This is the death of radio. That was sort of what really sparked. And then from those shows that I was listening to from Leo and from Adam, I started stealing stuff that they were doing in their podcasts to create the format that we had at ESPN. And then every show that I was a part of at that point basically took that basic format that I had created and just evolved it to fit whatever category sport we were talking about in that particular podcast.
Do you kind of remember a eureka moment of when you said, oh, this is going to take over the radio?
I mean, it was literally right when I learned what a podcast was. I was sitting there going, you're telling me that people can listen to these things whenever they want, how they want, wherever they want. This is beyond brilliant. This is something that I've always wanted. It's on-demand audio, just like on-demand television. To me, it just made everything about podcasting, when I was first introduced to it, made perfect sense to me, of giving the control back to the listener, giving the listener sort of the democratization of the audio experience. The listener is going to tell me what makes a great show. I'm not going to tell the listener what a great show is. The listener is going to tell me. And I'm going to know that because I'm going to produce these things. And if nobody's listening to it, then I'm not going to produce these things anymore. But if my audience continues to grow year over year over year, then I know I'm onto something. And I know that I can take this medium and continue to evolve it.
Yeah, it sounds like you were an early adopter. You were all in from the jump. Do you think that podcasting now is where you thought it would be, or plus or minus?
I thought we'd be much further along than where we're at now. It's funny, I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and I thought then what they were telling me some of the same things that I was saying 15 years ago about the death of radio, and how, there are things that seem to be ramping up to making that happen. And it's funny how a new person who's just getting into the business is sort of feeling that way now, 15 years later. And quite honestly, I have a feeling 15 years from now, there's going to be another new person that gets involved in podcasting and be like, oh, this is the death of radio. I don't think radio is ever going to die, so to speak. But I do think that what we're doing in podcasting is going to evolve radio in a good way, which I think is for the best for all mediums.
So speaking of evolving and radio in a good way, ESPN known for initially the broadcasting, how did that transition get into the podcast space and get NFL fans and excited about podcasts there?
That was the natural step, right? If ESPN is the worldwide leader in sports, there's a television base and there's a radio base, and there's a online base with ESPN.com, then any sort of medium that were to be born at that point, ESPN needs to be involved in a sports way. And that was exactly, my first podcast was called First and 15. That was the very first podcast that I was involved with. And the idea was we were going to present the news of the day in the NFL world in a 15-minute chunk or less. We quickly learned that putting all of the NFL news into one 15-minute chunk on a daily basis was impossible to do, at least based on what we wanted, what me and the host wanted to have the show be. There was no way we're going to be able to contain it to 15 minutes. And so the show became Football Today. And from there, all the other sports started getting involved and wanted their own podcasts. So there was a Baseball Today podcast, and everything was a today. So it was ESPNU College Football Today. And then Matthew Berry gets hired by ESPN, and he comes to the office and has an idea for what they're doing from a fantasy perspective. At that point, there were two fantasy shows. There was a show that was weekly called the Fantasy Focus, and there was another show called the Fantasy Fix. And Matthew wanted to change the branding of what they were doing from an audio perspective and decided that Fantasy Fix sort of meant something that was going to be short. The Fantasy Focus was going to be was not going to be short. That was for sure. And so the branding went with the Fantasy Focus, and they made a Fantasy Focus Baseball and a Fantasy Focus Football. And that was Nate Ravitz, who mentioned that. And that was another one of those, I don't have to have my peanut butter mixed with my chocolate moments, where, the game of fantasy baseball and fantasy football are very different. And there are very different strategies behind those two particular sports.
Do you think that the success of, like you said, not having your peanut butter with your chocolate for football, baseball, basketball, hockey, as far as the podcasting space goes, do you think that helped the NFL networks and those guys of the world realize that, yeah, if we have our own channel, we probably will have enough viewership?
I never thought of it that way, but now that you mention it, yes. I think there was a proof of concept that was occurring with the podcasting landscape that helped the television channels make those leaps to just football content, just baseball content. Absolutely think that podcasting probably helped make that happen. I'm sure there were some moves in the television industry to make those things happen before podcasting came about, but I wouldn't be surprised if podcasting helped accelerate it.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, my world, I'm an NFL guy, and that's pretty much all I focus on or pay attention to. So ESPN doesn't do much for me other than, watching the fantasy football shows or Monday Night Football and that kind of thing. So I really can appreciate the podcasting space where I can listen to Matthew Berry, I can listen to the Fantasy Footballers, I can listen to Locked On Podcast, the Detroit Lions one, and I can go from there.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Locked On, as that's my newest employer, and that was the next obvious evolution in sports podcasting. Well, if we've got just football podcasts and just baseball podcasts and just hockey podcasts, why aren't we having just team podcasts? And that was something that David Locke caught on to not too long ago, about 4 years ago or so at this particular point when the Locked On Network first launched. And that's the concept there. It's not just, I don't have to have my peanut butter with my chocolate. It's now, I can have dark chocolate or milk chocolate or whatever version of chocolate or whatever version of peanut butter you want to make the analogy with. Now it's gone down all the way down to a team, a very specific team. I do wonder if the Players Association or the Players Tribune tried to take that next evolution to make it just a player. And I think that might be where it might be too much specificality, if that's a word.
Yeah, it might be, but then again, there's people out there that are willing to, if they're that diehard about a particular player or in the celebrity space, they want to know everything about them.
Also true. There's plenty of celebrity podcasts, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I did want to talk about Locked On Podcasts a little bit. You're now the executive producer there. Is that what your title is?
That is my title.
And how long ago did you join that network?
I was hired in August of 2019. Actually, I guess technically September of 2019, not August.
Tomato, it's all about the same thing.
Exactly.
Going back to the ESPN experience and Fantasy Focus, you were an award-winning podcast producer as well. How many did you get there?
I lost count. I think there's 8 or 9 podcast awards for the Fantasy Focus. It did get to a point where we had won too many, so to speak. And Todd Cochran, who's the founder of the podcast awards, was looking for a way to still honor those shows that were going to continue to win no matter what. And I suggested to him, you should just rename that category for that particular show. Now, I don't know what he plans on doing when the fantasy footballers continue to win. Like if the award will get renamed the Fantasy Focus Fantasy Footballers Sports Award. But I made that suggestion to him and he loved it. And so now for the podcast awards, the different categories that exist that have a podcast name, it's because those particular shows were consistent winners year after year after year.
When you guys were producing the podcast, what was the biggest moment that, I should say, unexpected moment where you guys had to think on the fly?
Oh, that's a tough question. I mean, I feel like we flew by the seat of our pants in almost every
yeah,
day.
It sounded like
it was one of those planned chaoses where Matthew was a big fan, still is. I was too, of Howard Stern and the way that Howard Stern produced his particular program. And one of the biggest mantras was, it's always on the air. There's nothing behind the scenes. We're going to peel back the curtain. You're going to see everything. You're going to see how the sausage is made as we're putting the show together. And so when you do that, there's lots of things that will come up. As I mentioned, I'm the evil producer. I'm the one that's always challenging the hosts. If they're saying something and I feel like there's not enough context given to what they're talking about, I'm going to jump in and I'm going to be like, hey, you got to put that in proper context. What about this? What about this particular aspect? What about this particular statistic? One of the things I often joke about, and Matthew still does this to this day, and I always used to laugh, is he would say, well, I don't think he's top 10, but he's top 12. Which I was always like, wait a second. So he's only 2 spots off and you're making a half an hour argument about the fact that he's 2 spots lower than top 10? Come on. We didn't have to spend a half an hour on this. I always chuckled. And whenever I hear somebody else do that, I'm like, why are you pulling a Matthew Berry right now? He's not top 15, but top 20, I think. Yeah. Like, so there's only 5 spots there. That's the sort of thing that I think really made the podcast natural for people. We're talking about a brand new medium when we first launched, and how are we going to get people to listen to this new thing? Like, what's going to make people really become involved in it? And it was us opening up that curtain and sort of showing how everything is made, and then interacting with our audience and taking audience suggestions to things that they wanted to hear, and us reacting either positively or negatively to those suggestions, I think really helped grow the show as we, moved through the decade.
Were you there when they started doing the live performances?
No, that happened right after I left. That was something that was in discussions. I had been part of a behind the scenes pilot. We had tried one, sort of trying to produce the podcast the same way that they were doing the radio shows at ESPN. And it turned into one of those things where there just wasn't enough space to make that sort of thing happen. So it took a little bit longer for the Fantasy Focus to finally get an available studio to make that sort of thing happen. But, everything at ESPN continues to evolve and continues to get bigger. So space becomes more readily available as it continues to grow.
Yeah, and when you did have the podcast episodes, you would bring on guests from the world and the space. Who was your favorite guest from the NFL?
Oh boy, that's a tough question. That's like asking me who was my favorite child.
That's why I'm saying, yeah, what's the one that just came in your head right now? Boom, 3, 2, 1.
Well, I will tell you, I loved meeting some of the wrestlers, Hulk Hogan, The Rock. Hulk Hogan was great just from the standpoint that you met him and he was a wonderful, genuine man. And he sits down in the studio and he's getting the background on our show and sort of understanding what we're doing. And he goes, all right, so do you want the full experience? Like, should I turn it up? And we're like, yeah, sure. Do whatever feels natural for you. And it was one of those things where as soon as we turn on the mic, bam, the Hulkster is here, brother. He completely changed his persona to the Hulkster, which was phenomenal. I love the picture that I took with Rob Gronkowski. He had come through and he's ginormous. He's 6'6". And I have a picture that I took with him. I'm only 5'5". So I'm shaking his hand and I'm just staring up at him like a little child. And the difference in height, there's a chair that's right next to me in this particular picture. And my mom always thought that I was sitting in the chair. I was like, oh, no. I'm standing up as tall as I possibly can. And then the other guy that really stood out to me was Hugh Jackman, the actor. Came in and he was just enthralled with our podcast awards. We had them on a shelf in the studio and he comes in and he sees all the awards and he's like, this is more than I've got. And he grabbed them all. He's like hugging all of our podcast awards, talking with us. It was fantastic.
Yeah, you mentioned Rob Gronkowski, and I know you said you're a Patriots fan. What's your favorite Patriots moment of all time?
My favorite Patriots moment of all time is the final game of Drew Bledsoe's rookie year. You know, the Patriots at that point have another losing season, but we've got Bill Parcells, we've got this rookie quarterback, we've got a newer owner in Robert Kraft coming in, and everything. You know, there's some hope, but at the same time, we're at the end of the season, hasn't gone all that great. We're playing Miami, and we've gone to overtime, and Bledsoe throws a bomb to Michael Timpson, of all wide receivers, and they score and they win the game. And I'm like, that's it. It's our future. We're going to go to Super Bowls, multiple Super Bowls. We're finally not going to suck anymore. And we did. Bledsoe did bring us to a Super Bowl. And you could argue he brought us to the first Super Bowl we won, too. But I guess there was another guy named Tom Brady that was involved in all that.
Yeah. We talk about that guy every now and then on the show, and I'm a Detroit Lions fan, so I always say the stinking Patriots just out of respect, but at the same time, it's like, come on, man, when's our shot going to be?
It'll come. It's always cyclical, right? So, I mean, like I mentioned, I've been a Patriots fan since 1984, maybe even 83, and I lived through some really, really lousy seasons. I lived through a 1-in-15 season. I know what suck in the NFL is. Obviously, these last 2 decades have been phenomenal to be a Patriots fan. And my son has never, this is crazy, my 16-year-old son has never experienced a losing season for the New England Patriots.
That's incredible.
I can't believe I can even say something like that, because I remember a time when I thought, are the Patriots ever going to have a winning season?
Right.
17 straight years of 10+ wins right now, which is unbelievable. I mean, when my son can sit there and cry because the Patriots didn't win the Super Bowl again, I try and remind him they weren't this good all the time. And by the way, the suck will come again. There's going to be a period where you're going to be crying because they don't have a winning season.
Right, yeah. Just tell him to be a Detroit Lions fan for a while. My dad has not seen them win a championship because their last one was back in 57. My grandpa has, of course. My hope is just that they win a Super Bowl for my grandpa before he finds the other guy.
Well, I don't know what they put in the water in Boston, but, you know, it used to be that way for Red Sox fans, too. And again, my son knows what experiencing a World Series championship is like. But there was a long time when I was growing up that I too was like, are the Red Sox ever going to win a World Series? I don't think they will. I think they really are cursed. And Cubs fans will tell you the same thing. It'll happen. It's just a matter of when.
Well, speaking of curse, and we won't talk about the Lions curse or, the other Bambino curse, but a segment of the show is I like to take my guests and give you the keys to my DeLorean. You can go back in any point in NFL history, but you can't change the outcome. What moment are you going to be present for?
I can't change the outcome. I can go back to any point in NFL history, but I can't change the outcome. I guess for me, I'm going to go to the moment that Drew Bledsoe is drafted as the Patriots' number 1 overall pick in the NFL draft. I remember it was, is it going to be Bledsoe or is it going to be Meyer? Bledsoe or Meyer? And of course, Meyer was the more popular quarterback that more people knew about because he played at Notre Dame. And Bledsoe was this kid out on the West Coast from Walla Walla, Washington, and nobody knew who this guy was. But he had a giant arm and could obviously play in snowy weather. And I remember I was a guy that was on the fence. I was never 100% Bledsoe or 100% Meyer. I saw the key qualities in both quarterbacks that I wanted to see on my team. But that was also the first year of Bill Parcells as the head coach of the New England Patriots. And I knew that our fortune was going to change because we finally had a quality head coach that could make something really happen. And whatever guy he picked was going to be the guy who was going to back 100%. And the reason why to this day I remain a Bledsoe guy, and the joke I always make is Drew Bledsoe is the greatest Patriots quarterback of all time. Tom Brady is the greatest quarterback of all time, but Bledsoe is the greatest Patriots quarterback of all time. And the reason I make that joke is because it wasn't that much longer that the Patriots were moving out of Boston and they were heading to St. Louis. And if you go to the Patriots Hall of Fame, they even have a tire in the Patriots Hall of Fame for the St. Louis Mustangs. There's a hat and a mock uniform that were created that was going to be the Patriots. They were heading to St. Louis. And if they had moved, I was like, well, I can't be a Jets fan. I can't be a Giants fan. I guess the next closest team for me to root for would be the Buffalo Bills. Thank God I didn't have to become a Buffalo Bills fan. But Bledsoe saved my franchise from moving. And that's why I will forever be a Bledsoe fan over a Brady fan, even though Brady brought 6 Super Bowl rings and maybe more. I had a friend who was a Brady fan, and when he won the first Super Bowl, I was so mad because I was like, Bledsoe should never have lost his job. He should never have been traded away from this team. How dare Bill Belichick do these things? And my buddy looked at me and he's like, listen, how many rings will it take Brady to win for you to finally be a Brady guy? And I was like, I don't know, maybe 5. If he gets a fistful of rings, sure, I'll pick Brady over Bledsoe.
Well, I guess you just lost it, yeah.
So now that I'm good, now he's got 6. I'm still stubbornly a Bledsoe guy, but I mean, there's no denying the greatness that is Tom Brady.
Well, speaking of Bledsoe and Brady, did you ever get a chance to meet either one of them?
I did get a chance to meet Drew Bledsoe. He was doing a meet and greet selling his wine at a Connecticut liquor store. And I got to meet him and shake his hand and have a picture of him with my son. And, I've tried to raise my son right and tried to teach him all the wonders of Drew Bledsoe, but my son is too smart for that. And I said, Dad, you're so wrong on the Bledsoe thing. It's not even funny. But I took him with me to go meet Drew Bledsoe and said hello and talk to him about how big a fan I was. And hey, you want to do this podcast thing?
Right.
He didn't take me up on it.
So Bledsoe and saving the franchise, I didn't even know that they were considering moving to St. Louis. You said they were going to be called the Mustangs?
Yep. They were moving to St. Louis. They were going to be called the St. Louis Mustangs. Robert Kraft and the way that he went about purchasing the Patriots was brilliant. He started by purchasing all the land surrounding what was called Foxborough Stadium at the time. And that was where all the parking was. And as he continued to buy up more and more of the land, eventually he got to a point where he was like, well, I need to buy the stadium and the team. And Kraft was a Patriots fan. He had season tickets and was looking to purchase the team. And I don't remember all of the ins and outs and the details, but they were very stubborn. And the owner of the Patriots at the time was getting ready to move the team because he just couldn't make it fiscally happen for the Patriots because they stunk. They couldn't sell out the stadium. And quite frankly, Foxborough Stadium was, you want to talk about a horrible experience. We're talking aluminum benches, no backs, no cup holders, no individual seats. It was horrible. And we're still talking, I mean, this is 1996, 97, somewhere in there. So, I mean, the stadium experience was already vastly improved at other places around the United States. Kraft comes in, he buys the team, he builds his own stadium without NFL funding, without personal licenses. Now we have the Razor Gillette Stadium, 1,000,000 times better than what old Foxborough Stadium used to be.
Yeah, I've kind of driven close to the stadium. I've never actually been there. I've, of course, only seen it on TV. So I got to imagine the newer stadiums are pretty much state of the art, untouchable.
It's such a better experience. It's funny too because, this past week in the NFL, the Washington Redskins were having trouble selling tickets and sold them for $5 a pop. Patriots, who were hosting the Dallas Cowboys, ticket values were said to be on the lowest end, $420 a pop. So getting into the stadium now is 100,000 times more difficult than what it used to be to get in. I remember when you could buy $1 ticket to go see the Patriots because no one was in the stadium. And I bring that up because even if you see a camera shot of the crowd in Foxborough, oftentimes you'll see the red seats are still extremely empty, especially at halftime. Well, the problem that has arisen, or at least what the Crafts have done, is those are the club seats. And so all those people get to go into the special indoor club, which is right at what would be a luxury box level. And they don't need to go back outside in the cold and the rain and whatever. They can watch the game in the stadium, but inside the stadium. So they're heated and warm, and it's a much more pleasant experience, obviously, than braving the cold and the rain and the snow. But that's oftentimes why you'll see empty seats at Foxborough. All those seats have been purchased and bought, and all those people are at that stadium. They just happen to be indoors.
Huh, yeah. I mean, the Cowboys and Patriots, speaking of that, Forbes releases their valuations every year, and Cowboys, I think, were at $5.5 billion, and the Patriots were number 2 at 4 something. I'm not sure what it was.
Yeah, I don't know the specific numbers either, but I know that it's been that way ever since Jerry Jones purchased the Cowboys. The Crafts have done wonderful things. Like I said, the brilliance that Robert Kraft did in purchasing the Patriots is buying all of the land that surrounded the stadium. So he's since built an entire experience outside of the stadium with a giant shopping plaza, 2 giant shopping plazas, really. And in those shopping plazas, there are different experiences there too, including a Bass Pro Shop that has a cranberry bog in the back. And they do all sorts of wonderful community events it's called Patriot Place. There's a movie theater, a giant movie theater, also that's part of Patriot Place. The Crafts will never run out of money based on the amount of revenue that everything involved with the Patriots in that particular area where the stadium is continue to generate to this very day.
Yeah, and speaking of not running out of money and something that's been around forever, this is the 100th year of the NFL. And through your extensive experience with, being a podcast producer and ESPN and now with Locked On Podcasts and all the daily, what do you think you've learned the most about the history of the game throughout that time?
What have I learned the most? Well, I mean, I would just say that when you become a producer of content, or at least the way that I looked at being a producer of content was you have to always look back at the history. What came before? How can we take what came before and evolve it into what is happening today? And how can we take what we're doing today and evolve it into what's going to happen tomorrow? And that's always been my approach to producing content. And so I came through ESPN. I mean, my first job at ESPN was to be a board operator on the overnight show, on the overnight radio show. And I managed to work my way through the career ladder to become a producer of content on the podcasting side of things. And that was always due to my curiosity of, well, what happened before? And so by producing football podcasts, what came before? Working with Ivan Maisel on the ESPNU college football podcast, and Ivan's friendship with Bino Cook, taught me a lot about embracing the history of college football and understanding the evolution of college football to professional football. It's just, to me, if you don't know what's happened before, you have no idea how to make what's going to happen today, and you certainly don't know what's going to come tomorrow.
Yeah, I agree. That's one reason why I created the show is I like to know where we came from to be able to help me understand where we're going or how we got to where we're going to be. Speaking of that and creation and also fan engagement, you still host the Next Fan Up podcast?
I do. That's the show I created after I left ESPN with the 32 superfans, one fan each for every NFL team.
Are these super fans, were they all podcasters previously, or are they somehow, how did you find the super fans?
Some of the super fans were guys that listened to Football Today and were fans of Football Today. Some of them, though, have moved on, and we just put out a call to our, to people that listen to the show. We're like, if you want to represent this team, send us an application and we'll consider it. So that's part of the problem is I keep bringing in listeners to be super fans. So I don't have any listeners to the podcast anymore.
Right. Yeah. What's the premise behind that? If you have 32 every week, or is it 32 broken up?
I wish. If we had 32 guys on all at once, it would be sort of a mess. No, we sort of run it as sort of a round table with about 4 or 5 of us, but we try and get as many contributions from as many of the super fans as we possibly can, especially the ones that are most prevalent on that particular week. So for instance, right now, the Ravens are having a moment. We're going to be leaning quite heavily on our Ravens super fan until the Ravens are no longer relevant, which probably won't happen until they meet in the AFC Championship against my Patriots and they lose. Because that's the way things work around here these days. We have the Patriots Invitational, aka the Super Bowl. That's
right, yeah.
That's what happens every year. But the concept behind the show was always been, when telling a story, you need to have as many different perspectives as possible because that will provide you the clearest version of what the truth really is. My perspective is obviously going to be quite different than that of the Ravens superfan, and it's going to be quite different than that of the Cowboys superfan, or different than the Rams superfan. When we can bring in the different perspectives, we can get a better idea of what's happening. One of the things that I'm very proud of that we do on our show is our power rankings, because our power rankings reflect the opinions of 32 fans. So it reflects 32 different perspectives. So when we present our power rankings, it's not just one guy who's in the back room that goes, the Patriots are the best team in the AFC, the 49ers are the best team in the NFC, we'll place them 1 and 2 and then build out from there. No, we take 32 guys, they all put together their power rankings, it all gets put into a formula that one of our smarter superfans he does for a living. So he's got a whole sort of algorithm with standard deviation and all sorts of good stuff. And so we present, I believe, the truest power rankings of the NFL that exist because it has 32 different perspectives.
Do you have a website that accompanies this podcast, or just find it through the podcast players?
I wish we had a website. It would be smart of us to have a website. No, currently, you can find us wherever great podcasts are heard. We do have a Facebook group, facebook.com/NFU podcast. And that's a great way to interact with us on the social media. It gives you a little bit more than the 240 characters on Twitter.
Speaking of websites, though, your current employer, Locked On Podcast, is lockedonpodcast.com. And I'd like to just touch it up with the end here, covering I'm an NFL fan. What can Locked On Podcast do for me?
Well, if you're an NFL fan, there's a number of different shows that you can listen to. First, there's a podcast for every team in the NFL. We also have a Locked On NFL show, which features one of my former colleagues from ESPN, Matt Williamson. He's one of the co-hosts on that particular show. So you'll get a daily show Monday through Friday of your favorite team, your team every day. The NFL show is also Monday through Friday. There's a draft show that is a part of the network, Locked On NFL Draft. And I think we have 2 draft shows, to tell you the truth. So if you're looking for the latest information on the upcoming NFL draft, we've got you covered there too.
Yeah, and again, you can get to the Locked On Podcast by heading to lockedonpodcast.com. You can get them through any of your podcast players or anywhere else that you want the fans of the show to check out you or the Locked On Network.
That is correct.
All right, well, Jay, Pod Vader, thanks again for riding shotgun with us. Anything you have to leave these fans with of the football history, dude?
Just remember, it is the Patriots Invitational now. We can call it Patriots Invitational 7 if you'd like. Or we can start it with number 1 at this particular point in time. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty much the Patriots are the AFC representative, and then whatever team from the NFC wants to lose to them at the final game of the NFL season. It's pretty much what happens now.
We can also call it the anti-Eli Mannings, I suppose.
Yeah, we don't. I don't know what you're talking about, bro.
We don't talk about.
I don't recall.
Okay.
I don't recall an Eli Manning in the Super Bowl. No.
All right. Well, thanks again, Jay, for stopping by in the DeLorean to ride shotgun, and have a very good rest of your week.
Thank you.
Well, there you go. Pod Vader. Not the Podfather, because that name was already taken, as he said. But as far as sports podcasting goes, and shows like my favorite, the Fantasy Footballers, we have Pod Vader, of course with other people, but a lot of it has to do with Pod Vader to thank for getting this whole sports podcasting medium set up for us. And if you want to learn more about Pod Vader and what he's done to help the space, I recommend you heading over to his dedicated page on my website. That's thefootballhistorydude.com/podvader. Also, of course, if you enjoyed this show or any of the other episodes, then go ahead and please share it with a football dork such as yourself so they can learn about Pod Vader and the 100 years of the NFL. I hope that you enjoyed this unique type of episode where we get to gain a little bit of gridiron knowledge nuggets of not just the Pod Vader, but behind the scenes takes of the early years of ESPN podcasts. Now, next week, we are going to take that DeLorean further back in time to the beginning again to talk about another original NFL team, the Cleveland Tigers. But for now, dudes, I'm through if you're through.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Football History Dude. To make sure you're the first to get the next episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice and head on over to thefootballhistorydude.com for the show notes and more information on the history of the NFL. And remember, dudes, where we're going, we don't need roads.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.